Montana winters were unforgiving. The snow fell thick, covering the roads like a death shroud, turning the world into a vast, unbroken expanse of white. I'd driven through storms before. I was an ambulance driver back home in Mississippi, where the winters were gentler, more forgiving. Here, the land seemed to take a cruel pleasure in its isolation. My truck, a battered Chevy I'd bought secondhand, sputtered and groaned as I crawled up the winding back road. The snowstorm had worsened over the last hour, the windshield wipers barely keeping pace. Then it happened. A loud clunk, the engine stuttering and then dying completely. "Damn it," I muttered, thumping the steering wheel. I stepped out into the cold, pulling my jacket tight against the biting wind. The snow was relentless, falling in heavy sheets that muffled the world around me. I popped the hood and peered into the mess of wires and metal, though I knew it was hopeless. Cars weren't my specialty. The idea of walking back down the road wasn't appealing. The nearest town was at least 15 miles away, and the storm wasn't letting up. I grabbed my bag from the truck, slinging it over my shoulder. It held a flashlight, a hunting knife, and some basic supplies, enough to survive for a night or two if I had to. I spotted a faint trail leading off into the woods. It wasn't marked, but it was better than freezing to death on the roadside. The snow was deep, each step a struggle as I pushed through the drifts. The forest swallowed me whole, the tall pines looming overhead. The storm's howling winds were muffled here, replaced by an eerie silence. I found a small clearing after what felt like hours. There, tucked against the base of a hill, was an old, weather-beaten cabin. Relief washed over me. Shelter. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty woods. Inside, the cabin was sparse but intact. A fireplace, a rickety table, and a cot with a thin blanket. I lit a fire, the warmth a welcome relief from the freezing cold. As the flames grew, shadows danced across the walls, making the small space feel larger than it was. The first night passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, a prickling at the back of my neck that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. By the second day, the storm had lessened, but a steady, icy rain had taken its place. I ventured outside, hoping to find some sign of the road or perhaps another traveler. That's when I saw them, tracks in the snow. At first, I thought they were deer tracks, but they were too large, too misshapen. They led deeper into the woods, each print sinking unnaturally deep into the snow. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The tracks stopped at a tree, their owner nowhere in sight. The bark was clawed, deep grooves raking down its length. My stomach churned. A faint sound like a branch snapping drew my gaze upward. Something moved in the shadows, too quick to see clearly. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of the rain tapping against the leaves. That night, I stayed by the fire, my knife within reach. Sleep eluded me as the hours dragged on, the shadows outside the cabin growing darker, more oppressive. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl, barely audible over the crackling fire. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The growl came again, closer this time. The fire's light flickered and I saw it, a figure just outside the window. It was tall, its silhouette gaunt and skeletal, its eyes, faintly glowing, locked onto mine. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The creature didn't move, just stared, as if deciding what to do with me. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The next day, I made the decision to leave. I packed my bag, dousing the fire and stepping into the cold rain. The creature's tracks circled the cabin, their size and depth sending shivers down my spine. I moved quietly, sticking to the densest part of the woods to avoid open spaces. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. The rain masked most sounds, but I could hear it following me, its breathing low and ragged. I reached the road by dusk, my clothes soaked and my body trembling with exhaustion. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The car skidded to a stop, the driver, a middle-aged man, jumping out. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Get me out of here," I croaked, collapsing onto the asphalt. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods. The creature stood at the edge, its hollow eyes watching as the car disappeared into the night. The sun hung low in the sky, its orange glow casting long shadows over the dense New York woodlands. We hadn't seen another car for miles, just trees, endless rows of them lining the narrow, winding road. I was behind the wheel, my dog Max curled up in the back seat. We were heading to a cabin I'd found online, a summer getaway for me and my 3 friends, Sam, Carly, and Marcus. Sam rode shotgun, fiddling with the playlist, while Carly and Marcus sat in the back, arguing over something trivial. Max's ears twitched at their raised voices, but he stayed still, his head resting on my spare hoodie. Everything was fine until the engine sputtered. "What the hell?" I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter as the car began to slow. "What's going on?" Sam asked, sitting up straighter. "Engine's dying," I replied. The dashboard lights flickered before the car rolled to a complete stop. I tried the ignition twice, but it didn't even click. "Great," Marcus groaned. "Middle of nowhere. Classic." I glanced at the road ahead, empty, and then behind us. Nothing but trees. The air felt heavier now, as if the woods were holding their breath. We decided to push the car to the side of the road. The summer heat had given way to stifling, humid stillness. Clouds were thickening overhead, dulling the light and adding to the sense of unease. Sam checked his phone. No service. Carly sighed. Figures. What now? There was a trail a little ways back, I said. Maybe it leads somewhere. Better than sitting here. We grabbed our things, water bottles, flashlights, my multi-tool, and headed into the woods. Max trotted beside me, his tail wagging slightly, though his ears were perked up, alert. The trail was overgrown, winding deeper into the forest. The air grew cooler as the sun disappeared behind the thick clouds. We walked in silence for a while, and the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot the only sound. "What's that smell?" Carly asked, wrinkling her nose. I noticed it too, a faint, rotten stench, like decaying meat. Max stopped, his nose twitching, and let out a low growl. "Easy, boy," I said, patting his head. Up ahead, the trail opened into a small clearing. There was an old fire pit in the center, surrounded by scattered beer cans and crumpled snack wrappers. "Looks like someone camped here," Marcus said. "Recently," Sam added, pointing to a charred log in the pit. We decided to stop and rest, building a small fire with the leftover wood. The flames crackled, their light casting eerie shadows over the trees. The smell lingered, stronger now, but we couldn't pinpoint its source. As night fell, the woods seemed to come alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. Max sat close to me, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl. Everyone froze. "What the hell was that?" Carly whispered. Max stood, his fur bristling. He barked once, sharp and loud, before falling silent. "Stay calm," I said, gripping my flashlight. Something moved just beyond the firelight, a shadow slipping between the trees. I shined the beam in its direction, but whatever it was stayed hidden. "Maybe it's a bear," Marcus said, though his voice wavered. "That's no bear," Sam muttered. The growl came again, closer this time. A pair of eyes glinted in the darkness, reflecting the firelight. They were too high off the ground to belong to anything natural, their stare unrelenting. I grabbed my multi-tool, flipping the blade open. "Stay together. Don't run." The creature stepped into the light for just a moment, a flash of dark fur, elongated limbs, and a snout lined with sharp teeth. Then it was gone, disappearing back into the shadows. "Run!" Carly screamed, breaking the tense stillness. We bolted, the firelight fading as we plunged into the woods. I could hear the creature behind us, its heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. Max stayed close, barking fiercely, though his growls turned to whimpers as we ran. We didn't stop until we found another trail, this one narrower and overgrown. The creature's footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Is it gone?" Marcus panted, clutching his side. "I don't think so," I said, scanning the darkness. We moved cautiously, sticking close together. The trail led to an old, abandoned hunting shack, its roof sagging and windows broken. We slipped inside, barricading the door with a rusted table. Max sniffed at the corners, still on edge. Outside, the woods were silent. too silent. "What was that thing?" Carly asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, "but it's still out there." We waited for hours, the creature's presence pressing down on us like a weight. When dawn broke, we left the shack, moving silently through the woods. The creature followed us, always just out of sight. We saw its tracks, large, clawed prints, and heard its growls, but it never attacked again. By the time we reached a main road, we were exhausted, our clothes torn, and our nerves frayed. A passing truck stopped, the driver taking one look at us and ushering us in without a word. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods. The creature stood at the edge, its glowing eyes watching us leave. The rain had started as a drizzle, just enough to patter against the windshield and blur the edges of the road. By the time we reached the gas station, it had picked up into a steady downpour, soaking the lot outside and making the old pumps glisten under the buzzing fluorescent lights. I turned the wipers off and cut the engine, leaving us with just the sound of rain drumming on the car roof. "This place is charming," Emma said from the back seat, sarcasm dripping from her voice. "It's a gas station," I said, pushing open the door and stepping into the rain. "What were you expecting? A Michelin star?" My dog, Chase, a scruffy mutt with mismatched ears, jumped out after me, shaking off the rain. I grabbed the pump and started filling up while Sam and Eric, my gym buddies, stretched their legs. The four of us had planned this road trip for weeks, a chance to get away from the grind and clear our heads. The gas station itself was a relic from another era. The sign above the convenience store was missing letters, leaving it to read ILS, GS, and GO. Inside, I could see a single bored attendant leaning against the counter, flipping through a magazine. "Gonna grab snacks," Eric said, pulling up his hood and jogging toward the store. The rest of us hung back, the rain making conversation feel pointless. Chase sniffed at a puddle, his nose twitching at something I couldn't see. When Eric returned, he had a pack of jerky and a scowl. "The guy in there's weird," he said. "Kept staring at me like I was gonna rob the place." "Maybe you shouldn't look so sketchy," Emma teased, popping open a soda she'd pulled from the cooler in the back seat. We laughed it off and got back on the road, the rain coming down harder now. The plan was to camp near Moosehead Lake, a couple of hours away, but the storm slowed us down. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the forest. We decided to set up camp early, hoping the rain would let up by morning. The woods were dense, the kind that swallowed sound and made you feel smaller just standing there. We pitched the tents in a clearing, built a fire, and huddled around it as the rain hissed against the flames. The night felt heavier than it should have. Chase sat close to me, his ears up and his body tense. "You okay, buddy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. He didn't relax. "I think we should have kept driving," Emma said, staring into the fire. "What, and miss out on this charming wilderness?" Sam joked, but his laugh sounded forced. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. We all froze. "It's just the wind," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. The firelight flickered as if the forest itself was breathing. Then I saw it. Movement in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the flames. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "What?" Emma asked, her voice low. I pointed, but whatever it was had disappeared. Chase growled, a low, guttural sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Maybe it's a deer," Sam said, but we all knew better. The thing came closer, circling the camp, its heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I caught a glimpse, a hulking silhouette, tall and broad, its movements unnaturally smooth. It stayed just out of the firelight, as if it knew exactly where the shadows would hide it. Emma screamed as the creature lunged into the camp, knocking over one of the tents. Chase barked wildly, charging at it, but the thing swatted him away like a toy. I grabbed a branch from the fire, its end glowing with embers, and swung it at the creature. It roared, a guttural, inhuman sound that shook the ground beneath us. I couldn't make out its face, just dark fur and glowing eyes that burned with intelligence and malice. "Run!" I shouted, and we scattered. The woods were a blur of rain and darkness as we ran. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us, its growls mixing with the thunder above. Chase stayed at my side, limping slightly but refusing to fall behind. We regrouped near a large fallen tree, panting and soaked to the bone. "What the hell was that?" Eric whispered, clutching his side. "I don't know," I said, gripping the stick tighter. The embers had burned out, leaving me with nothing but a charred piece of wood. The creature wasn't far. I could hear it breathing, deep and ragged, as it stalked us through the trees. "We need to get back to the car," Sam said. "No kidding," Emma snapped, her voice shaking. We moved as silently as we could, the rain masking our footsteps, but not the creature's. It followed us, always just out of sight, its glowing eyes the only thing cutting through the darkness. When we reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with rain and shaking with adrenaline. The creature roared, breaking into a full sprint. "Get in!" I shouted, throwing the door open. Everyone piled in, and I started the engine just as the creature slammed into the side of the car. Its claws raked against the metal, leaving deep gashes, but the tires caught, and we sped away. As we drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature stood in the road, watching us, its glowing eyes the last thing I saw before the forest swallowed it whole.